What's up, design family, and welcome back to another episode of Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you back on the channel. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the different ways to cut knitted fabrics. Each of these three different methods that we'll be discussing on today's episode has its specific place in mass manufacturing and brings with it ultimately a host of advantages and disadvantages. So by the end of this episode, you'll have a much better understanding of what these three methods specifically are, when to deploy each, and what you can expect in a finished product created by each of these three different methods. What's up, design family, and welcome to Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you here. On this channel, we discuss all things sports fashion, graphic design, manufacturing, and technology. We'll discuss key topics, answer pressing questions, and provide actionable steps on starting your own product line. If you're interested in any of the above topics, stick around. You're in for a good one. Getting right into the video, we already mentioned that we have three key types of cutting methods when it comes to knitted fabrics. The first, and honestly the most common, is the all cut method. This is usually the method that you think of when you think of cutting fabrics. This is where all of the garment pieces are cut from the fabric and then are sewn together, or cut and sew. Essentially what you have is a flat piece of fabric where you'll draft the pattern outlines onto it, and you end up cutting the pieces directly out of the fabric, taking those pattern pieces and sewing them together. When it comes to the advantages and disadvantages, obviously there are a ton of advantages that have to do with the higher production rate. Usually what factories will do is that they will maximize the amount of pieces cut per specific cut by stacking the pattern pieces over each other and allowing the factory workers to cut multiple torso pieces or multiple sleeve pieces all at once. Also, it's not uncommon to see the fabrics being folded on their centerfold line, where by using one cut, you can actually cut two sides of the pattern. This is especially useful on symmetrical patterns, again, like the torso, like the collar pieces, and like the sleeve patterns. Usually with this type of method, because you need to use a lot of fabric, the cost of fabric per square inch or per square centimeter or square meter is much lower. This is specifically because you are purchasing a lot more at once, so this does drive the price down. Let's look at the disadvantages here. Well, number one is this type of methodology is quite labor intensive. You need a lot of hands on deck to pull it off effectively. And there is a much higher rate of fabric wastage. When you're cutting the pieces out of the fabric piece, what ends up happening is that around the areas which you're cutting, these are what are known as the leftover pieces. Usually those types of pieces need to be discarded. You can't really find much use for it, so there is a much higher rate of material wastage when it comes to this method. The second method that we'll be discussing today is the fully fashioned method. This method involves bringing pieces of the fabric or pieces of the garment that are fully knitted into their final form and then are stitched together using a dial linking machine. So let's just say you have a torso piece. Instead of having to draft that torso piece onto a flat piece of fabric and then cutting it and then sewing it together, you actually knit the torso piece exactly as you need it with the specific outline, making the room for the neckline, for the armhole, so on and so forth. When it comes to the advantages of this type of production method, number one is there's little to no cutting waste. You're effectively only creating the pattern piece that you need to sew, so you don't have any excess fabric that's left over. Also, this creates an effective production method. You're only producing what you need with minimal waste left over. The disadvantages here are typically a higher cost per unit. Because you're only creating the pieces that you need, you can't really automate that process. You have to create one piece at a time. So there's a lower volume of production, which ultimately does hike up the cost per unit. The last method that we'll be discussing on today's episode is going to be the integral method. This is where the garments are actually produced as a single piece. And when I say a single piece, I mean all of the different parts of the garment. The torso pattern, the sleeve pattern, the neckline, the hemline are all knitted as a single construction. And typically the ends and the beginnings of these garments are then joined together to seal off the garment to make it usable. When it comes to the advantages of this type of production, well, they're simple. You actually have a low labor cost. This is specifically because you don't need a lot of hands on deck and actual manual labor to cut and sew, to stack the pieces, and then to sew them together. So this is a major plus. Also, there's quite a low amount of resource or material wastage, even lower than the fully fashioned method we just discussed. And lastly, it saves on sewing time. The garment is produced as a single piece, so you don't even need to sew the different pattern pieces together. When it comes to the disadvantages, well, we can already tell that this type of production needs highly specialized machinery. So there is a high investment upfront that has to be done in order to secure these machines. And you need to train and educate your staff and to have experienced technicians that are able to operate these machines efficiently and effectively. So these are also a major disadvantages. And there's a limitation in how many pieces you can produce per unit of time. So this is definitely something to bear in mind. That is a wrap on this episode, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I know it was quite a technical episode, but by now you should have a much better understanding of the 3 different types of ways to cut, sew, and join knitted fabrics. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please consider smashing a massive thumbs up. It really does help us out and ultimately lets more people see these videos. Also, consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't done so already. We put out great content on a week-to-week basis on pretty much everything to do with sportswear, graphic design, manufacturing, logistics, and we put out content consistently for the last 2 years, so definitely consider joining us. You won't regret it. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Fittdesign TV. Until next episode, stay awesome.